Welcome to the conversation on Italian and international culture of the Ragusa Foundation for the Humanities. I'm Andrea Ciccarelli, the president of the Ragusa Foundation, and today we have the pleasure to have with us Dean Anthony Julian Tamburri, Dean of the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute of Queens College, City University of New York, who will entertain us with a conversation entitled Local and Global, Italian-American Culture Between Shores and Across Continents. Anthony Tamburri, who received his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, is the Dean of the John D. Calandra Italian-American Institute at CUNY, as well as a Distinguished Professor of European Languages and Literatures. He is one of the most active, in fact, one of the founding parents, we could say, of Italian-American studies as an academic discipline. He has served as a member of the Executive Council of the Italian-American Historical Association since 1993, and he has been its president between 2003 and 2007, before serving as vice president and president of the American Association of Teachers of Italian. He is the co-founder with Paolo Giordano of Voices in Italian American and Italiana, both journals and publishing houses that have promoted Italian and Italian American culture together. And this, of course, this juncture is very important in the history of Italian American studies. He has been awarded the title of Cavaliere of the Italian Republic, as well as many other prestigious honors and awards, including the Lehman LaGuardia Award for Civic Achievement. Before joining the Calandra Institute, Tamburri has taught at Purdue University and Florida Atlantic University for many years, where he also served in various administrative capacities, such as chair of the department or associate dean for international studies. Dean Tamburri has published vastly on modern Italian literature and culture and Italian American studies. Amongst his many publications, and in fact, amongst his many books, we can at least mention Of Saltimbanchi ed Incendiari, Aldo Palazzeschi and Avant-Gardism in Italy, 1990, To Hyphenate or Not to Hyphenate, The Italian-American Writer, 1991, which is basically the beginning of the revolution, of the renaissance of Italian-American studies as we intend them today. A reconsideration of Aldo Palazzeschi's poetry, Revisiting the Saltimbanco, 1998, A Semiotic of Ethnicity in Recognition of Italian-American Writer, 1998 as well, Italian-American Short Films and Videos, A Semiotic Reading, 2002, Semiotics of Rereading, Gozzano, Palazzeschi and Calvino, 2003, Una Semiotica dell'Etnicità, Nuove segnalature per la letteratura italiano-americana, 2010, Reviewing Italian-Americana, Generalities and Specificities on Cinema, 2011, Un biculturalismo negato, La letteratura italiana negli Stati Uniti, 2018, Signing Italian-American Cinema, a more focused look, 2021. And as I mentioned, these are just some of the publications that he has done. So thank you very much for being with us, for being with me today, Anthony. Dean Tamburri and I have been knowing, Dean Tamburri and I have been knowing each other for a long time, and therefore
a few decades.
We will a few decades, unfortunately at the same time.
We're still here, so let's say
exactly. and so of course we will call each other by name. Yeah. So Anthony,
so let me just say,
yes,
thank you very much for that introduction. And I just want to say this, that, and I'm flattered that you see me as one of the quote unquote parents of Italian American studies, but let me just say this, that my work intellectually, editorially, is very much dependent on a couple of people that preceded me, right? One, of course, is Helen Barolini, and the groundbreaking work she has done. The others, of course, Robert Viscusi, the late Robert Viscusi. Unfortunately, we lost him a couple of years ago. And the really deep down sort of intellectual work, I think insightfully intellectual work that he did early on in what we might call, to abuse a term, the theory of Italian American literature. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
yes.
you know, those are two names, I think, within the cultural sphere. Of course, there are historians as well who precede, but that we need to really sort of see as the people who, you know, put it on the map basically and allowed it for people like me and Paolo and Fred and company to move forward. Yeah. I just wanted to tip my hat to them. Yeah.
No, thank you. This is very true, of course. And of course, I met Ellen Barolini, I know Ellen Barolini, and of course, and we all know her work, of course. And I met several times, many times, Robert Viscusi's Bob, and we all miss him, of course. And we all miss him at the piano playing his Columbus
Exactly.
his Columbus poem, reciting his Columbus poem and song, of course, at any events of the American Society of Italian Studies or similar. Yes, we all miss him, of course. Thank you for this precision, of course, Anthony. So given your professional role, today we will talk about Italian American Studies, not the Italian aspect in a sense. Of course, the two things are combined, obviously, as we said. But I would like to touch upon some of the multifaceted aspects related to the definition of Italian American culture and Italian American Studies, what it means today and where we stand in the academic world, as well as in terms of societal perception, because in your role, you have been an amazing promoter both of the academic and of the societal role of Italian American Studies since ever, but especially since you have been Dean of the Calandra Institute, of course. The first question I have, Anthony, is Italian American Studies, because of their transcultural and multicultural history, are probably more an area studies, in a sense, than a precise field. Migration studies, gender studies, colonial studies, visual arts, media, literature, cinema, as well as social sciences pertain to the broad category of Italian American Studies, depending on the various approaches and interests, of course. Before focusing a bit more closely to specific aspects, therefore, I would ask you to discuss the roles and designation that Italian American Studies as a field of study have acquired within the last few decades and how they are evolving and developing.
Okay, so let me talk more from the point of view of literature and cinema studies, only because I know that better, but I will start out with this sort of preface. From a point of view of historical and sociological studies, we really have to wait. And I know people out there, the historians will correct me on this, but I think we really have to wait until mid-century, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe the 30s, before we get sort of an Italian-American voice talking about Italian-American studies. Now, a caveat here, I don't want to say that you have to be Italian-American to study Italian-American studies. That by no means. I don't want to be an essentialist in any way. We know, in fact, that some of the earlier studies have been done by non-Italian Americans that were really good. We can argue to some degree or another with, you know, some of the points that they make, et cetera. But for example, one of the largest studies in the 20th century was 1919 by, I think it's Robert Forrester. And then of course, in 1943, we find a book called The Italian American Experience by Irwin Child, which is a really, really wonderful book, because I didn't know about that book when I was doing my little studies on the hyphen and you know, just trying to figure out what the hyphen is, what it could mean metaphorically, et cetera. Then I found it and I just thought, oh my God, this is wonderful, because he actually presents a paradigm that's a little bit different from the sort of traditional one that I see beginning with Daniel Aaron, the father of American studies. So there's stuff going on in his, and then of course, someone whom we're discovering today here at the Calandra Institute, we're trying to republish to some degree, is a scholar named Giovanni Schiavo. Schiavo started publishing in 1928 on, I think, the Italians in Missouri, then the Italians in Chicago. And he was someone who was studying for his doctorate, dropped out while he was writing his dissertation. He got a job, a decent job, whatever, and went on to publish a ton of books on more a chronicler than a historian, as one of our colleagues here called him, and I think that's correct. More of a chronicler than a hardcore historian, that we would have in mind, such as a Gabaccia, Donna Gabaccia, et cetera, but someone who put pen to paper early on and really gives us a sort of chronology of things that just wonderful. So there's that. Now, in literary studies, literary and cinema, we're fairly young. And that was the thing that sort of, what can I say, intrigued me to look into more what was going on. As you well know, the history of Italian-American literature dates back to the 19th century, right? Francesco Durante did that wonderful chronicling of it with Italo-Americana 1, Italo-Americana 2. The Italo-Americana 2 is more the literary, the previous one is more the travelers and things of that sort, right? So if we want to speak in terms of hyphenation, we tend to speak more with regard to the second volume, because those are the ones who came and stayed. Unfortunately, we have to wait until, so it starts in 1985, more or less, even though recently, in the last 2 decades, an earlier novel was discovered by Joseph Rocchietti, a novel published in 1835 called Lorenzo in Onalaska. And there was a type of critical edition that was published a number of years ago by Carol Albright, Ahern Bonomo, and also Elvira Di Fabio. The two of them put together these 2 publications by Rocchietti. So we have that. We have the novel, and we have also his essay, which is a very strange essay called Why National Literature Can't Exist in the United States, written in 1845. So it's wonderful. Okay, but we really have to wait until 1974 before we get a literary study, a book on Italian-American literature, and it's Rose Basile Green. And it was her PhD dissertation. And she really does a wonderful job at chronicling from basically 1885 to 1972, more or less, when obviously she had to hand in the manuscript, of let's say, Italian-American prose, because hers is called The Italian-American Novel, a documentation of an interaction of 2 cultures. And in the meantime, we have Helen Barlini, and we have Robert Viscusi, who's writing insightful essays. Helen's doing also her writing, both her critical and creative writing. And then, of course, she comes out with the Dream Book, which is an anthology of Italian-American women writing, but it's just wonderful as an anthology. Doesn't matter that they're all women. It's the first contemporary anthology we have on Italian-American literature, and she has a wonderful introduction. But we have to wait until 1996 for the second book, and that's Fred Gardefe's Italian Science, American Streets. And so I would say the middle to late 80s, with Barolini's anthology and some of the other essays that Robert is writing, and other people, but with the middle 80s on, things seem to start percolating in a way that they didn't before with regard to literary studies. We see more sessions at conferences on Italian-American literature. We see at Italian conferences, and there's an issue later on we'll get to with regard to Italian-American studies and Italian studies. So we see this interaction, and it's wonderful. The presence of Italian-American studies at Italian conferences is great. At other conferences such as MELUS, Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States, and MELUS really embraced Italian-American studies from the beginning. So we have that, and then all of a sudden, we start seeing a series of books coming out on Italian-American literature, and also more books on Italian-American history. Up until, let's say, the late 90s, we have Donna Gabaccia, we have Jans McLaughlin. We have the Leonardo, who are doing things that are historical, anthropological, sociological. And then all of a sudden there's this new generation. And I think we can say that perhaps Jennifer Guglielmo's book might be one, the one about women in the revolution, where she talks about, from a historical point of view, talks about Italian American women and labor and things of that sort. So, and today the books are just flying off the shelf. So it's wonderful that we have this production. Literary studies, the same thing. Cinema is interesting. Cinema I find very interesting. There are articles that are written. We can go back to the middle 80s where we have some really fine articles written. Our late friend Peter Bondanella, for example, did a great deal of work early on. His piece, for example, that appeared in, I think, the early 80s on Give Us This Day, which is the film version of Christ in Concrete, was very significant, not just for the work, the type of work it is, but the fact that he did that, the fact that it was out there, and the fact that it was in a collection that was published in Italy. That was really important. And we'll get to that too later, this whole interaction between Italy and the United States. But Peter and John Paul Russo did a couple of really wonderful essays in the mid to late 80s on The Godfather, for example, for the proceedings of the American Italian Historical Association. And then the things started to open up there as well. I want to mention another article, and again, one of our friends in Indiana, Ben Lawton, did, and I've always said to Ben, it was one of the best pieces I'd ever read on Italian American cinema. But Ben Lawton did a reading of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver through the lens of Pasolini's Liberated Cinema, and it appeared in Italian Americana, and it's just so smart, so smart. So we have a good foundation for that, and now I think we have at least a half a dozen single authored books on Italian American cinema, if not more, and we have a series of edited collections on Italian American cinema. So the interest is there, the production is there. Fortunately, here in the United States, for our colleagues with regard to promotion and things of that, professional promotion, the subject matter is being seen as a valid subject matter. And I mention that only because about 7, 8, 10 years ago, a couple of friends of mine in Italy who had been writing on Italian American studies didn't make it through the famous, if not infamous, abilitazione, because their work was on a field that wasn't really considered part of that whole, what can we call it, network, to look for that whole complicated network that the Italian system has come up with for what they call the abilitazione, the qualification for promotion. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a wonderful introduction, and in fact, it allows me to ask the second question that I thought about, even more, which is more specific, which we are more properly. And you have written on all aspects, as I mentioned before, of Italian American culture, on literary works and cinema and media. Focusing more on the aesthetic aspects now and their socio-political implications, because of course they're consequential, they're automatic. What do you believe are the major visible trends and characteristics that make Italian American works different than other studies?
Yeah.
It is just because somebody with an Italian last name or heritage has written a book or shot a movie? Obviously not. Or it has to do with a way of looking at things, a way of interpreting and perceiving life. You mentioned the book by Gardafè before, of course, which is basic. So what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so the sort of the knee-jerk reaction is to say anything written by an Italian American is an Italian American product, right? Or anything made by an Italian American is an Italian American product. Now that obviously it's very simplistic. So we have to come up with something a little bit less generic, right? So the way I see it is, of course, first and foremost, what are the thematics in the work, whether it's a piece of literature, prose poetry, or whether it's cinematic, right? And so we look at that. However, I think we can also look at other aspects of it. So there are themes that, okay, so just to use an Italian quote unquote reference. So spaghetti and meatballs is Italian American, right? Working class, however, is not just Italian American, right? Gender issues are not just Italian American, but they are also Italian American. So, and I point this out for two reasons. One, we look at films such as The Godfather, Mean Streets. And Mean Streets, I would say, people have spoken about Scorsese as a type of American neo-realist director. And that's something that I think still needs to be explored. I think there's a lot, and Scorsese himself has admitted to the fact that the whole neo-realist, including even Fellini, was a tradition or two traditions that really influenced him. But I think there's more work to do there. And I think that the film scholar who is really into the aesthetics and in the aesthetics in the sense of the structural makeup of cinema, of films, can really have a lot of fun, intellectually speaking, with that. So there's that. So there's the Godfather, there's Scorsese, there's some like Nancy Savoca's True Love, Nancy Savoca's Household Saints, the posters behind me, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. But then there are these other movies that may, or we can say are or are not Italian American. One movie I always go to as clearly Italian American, even though there are no Italian American characters, is The Deer Hunter. The Deer Hunter, first of all, The Deer Hunter, what Cimino has done in The Deer Hunter is really launched the genre of the Vietnam film, right? Because it's the late 70s, and it deals obviously with the soldiers coming back from Vietnam and then the impact that has on their families. But the other thing is, if you look at The Deer Hunter, it's working class, it's non-Anglo. Yes, they're white. They're Caucasus. Let's distinguish. With this term, white is really problematic, right? They're Caucasoid. Let's put it that way. But they're not Anglo. They're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And as we know, there is this sort of collective consciousness in the United States that is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? But then there are the non-Anglo white ethnics. So I would include not just Italian Americans, I would include the Poles, I would include the Irish, and so on and so forth. If you look at The Deer Hunter, if you take out the names that are Eastern European and stick in names that end in a vowel, it can easily be an Italian American movie because it deals with class, it deals with family, it deals with a lot of trauma that Italian American families, especially the early immigrant families, didn't want to deal with. And one example, of course, in literature where we see that is The Fortunate Pilgrim, the husband, Frank Corbo, who's in an institution, and for the most part, they really don't want to deal with it, right? So I think when we see a movie made by an Italian American but doesn't have the overt thematics, we can look at other issues. What are some of the other themes that come along? And I'll throw out another as a teaser to our spectators, to our audience. I'll throw out another teaser. And this is more of a collaboration, I would say. So Dirty Dancing, for example, right, takes place in upstate, in the Catskills, which was more than it still is, the vacation spot par excellence for Northeastern Jews, right? They all went to the Catskills, whatever, right? And it was actually, the script was written by a Jewish American woman. The film was directed by Emil Ardolino. People forgot, if you're not into contemporary American cinema and you don't go beyond the ethnic, you sometimes don't realize that there are more films made by Italian American, African Americans, whatever, than we think. And this is one of them that has always sort of tickled me. And I'm still not, I haven't arrived at a conclusion of my thoughts, but I'm always tickled that Dirty Dancing is a script written by a Jewish American woman and directed by an Italian American male, Emile Ardolino. And unfortunately, Ardolino only made 6 movies because then he died in the middle 90s. He was one of the early victims of AIDS, before the whole onset of therapeutics and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's again a very exhaustive, wonderful, specific answer. Now I have a question which is more, of course, going back to Italian and Italian American. We know about the contentious historical and cultural relationship between Italy, Italian culture, and Italian American culture. Their conflictual association and filiation that either culminate in rejection or in an accepted common genesis of one another, depending on the moments, of course. Could you please discuss the evolution of this controversial relationship?
Yeah, so my feeling is, and I'm going to give the responsibility to, but not to say blame, place the responsibility on both sides of the ocean. Look, Italy, you went through the school system in Italy. Italy doesn't study its migratory history. Right? Maybe there was a paragraph or two in one of the history books you read, right? When you were in K through 12 or K through 13, as it is in Italy, right? We don't either. We don't study our migratory history either. What we do study here, and it's just part of our history, or what we do recognize here because it's part of our history, is that we are and I say this in a positive way, we are a mongrel nation, right? We're a nation of many, right? Just that way. Okay. So we have a tad bit more, but still we don't study our migratory history. So that for me is one of the major issues. And so what happens is the stereotypes fly back and forth. Not so much Italian Americans versus Italians, but the Americans versus Italy. There's a stereotype about Italy, right? That even in 2022, people ask questions and you just sort of roll your eyes and say, really? Like, don't you realize that Italy's like number 5 of the G5, 6, 7, 8, whatever it is? Don't you realize that it has as a prime minister today, the guy who basically fortified the euro? Don't you realize, there are all those questions, right? Yet still we hear these silly questions about Italy. And I think part of that is due to the stereotyping here in America of Italian immigrants. And I think that stereotyping has been in some way, shape, or form brought back to Italy, and Italians have consumed that a little bit. And I think the other thing is, because Italians don't study their migratory history, there is not within the collective consciousness the notion that Italian migration was not just those who left, who escaped from La Miseria, as my parents and grandparents, my grandparents especially, used to say. When you talk to them about Italy, not all 4 of them, but a couple of them, La Miseria. All you heard was La Miseria, right? So there's that large pocket of Southern Italian, originally farmers, land workers, etc., who couldn't make it and saw that, sure, let's go to New York and become carpenters and plumbers and of course great stone workers, right? Not just bricklayers, but great stone workers. And that's the irony of it all in some ways when you think about it, that out of this artisanal world, I'm not talking, not the artists, the ones with the paintbrushes and stuff, but out of this artisanal world, Italians have become great woodworkers, great stonemasons, great everybody wants their fireplace made by an Italian, and so on and so forth. So it's a it's a lack of information, I think, on both sides. I'm, you know, you mentioned VIA, Voices in Italian Americana, Italiano, you know, Bordighera Press. Here's the irony of it all. We would not be where we are with Bordighera Press if it weren't for the Fondazione Giovanni Agnelli back in 1989. So people who don't know, the Fondazione Giovanni Agnelli is a foundation of the Agnelli family. And back in the up and through maybe the late 90s, it was basically part of the larger Agnelli network. And they had, of course, the team of Maddalena Tirabassi and company, who were doing wonderful historical and demographic studies on not just Italian Americans, but on what now we call the Italian diaspora. And so they were studying Australia, Argentina, South Africa, Brazil, et cetera, and as well as North America, the United States and Canada. And they came to us looking, this of course, Andrea, you know, as someone in the academy and do fundraising, they came to us looking to fund something. That's how lucky we were. And that stroke of luck really sort of set off the whole idea of Bordighera. So there are those pockets in it.
You were lucky, but you deserved it. We were lucky because you were lucky because you deserved it. I think that's why they came to you.
Well, you know, it was just a stroke of luck. It was just a conglomeration of, you know, of events coming together. Now, there are pockets like that in Italy. So there's now it's called the Centro Altre Italie. Now it's still in Torino now it's under the aegis of Globus et Locus, which is founded by Piero Bassetti, who is this very youthful, nonagenarian who still writes and has his own notion of a more broad notion of the hyphenated, not necessarily the hyphenated, but his notion of a type of worldwide commonwealth of Italian descendants and people who love Italy. So things are looking good, I think, hopeful in Italy. I know that I can say that in the early 2000s, some of the people in Italian studies, which, as you know, can be a little bit conservative, both methodologically as well as geopolitically, have opened up their sort of doors, their metaphoric doors. I studi Italiani for, I don't know, the last 7-8 years. There's a little rubrica section called Oltre Confine that they've entrusted to me, and that's Gino Tellini and Simone Magherini. And there are other things going on, you know. We've worked with the University of Calabria. They're doing things there. We now work with the University of Roma Tre. They're doing things. There's, of course, some of our colleagues who've been writing on, for example, Vito Zagario has been writing on Italian American cinema for many years, and there are others as well in Italy. So it's getting better. It's getting better, but we still, have, and I always pour Paolo Verzi because I always use him as an example. But, you know, my name is Tanino. When Tanino leaves Sicily to come to Rhode Island to visit with large, of course, Italian percentage-wise, it's the largest population, percentage-wise, right? Comes to meet his family, his relatives. They're sort of little, they're inarticulate. They're a little bit uneducated, they're a little bit mafiosetti, and so on and so forth, right? And you go, oh, Paolo, 2004, you could do better than that, you know? And so we still have some of those, but I think it's getting better, and I see some of the projects that the Italians are doing. There's this, and don't ask me to explain it, but that PRIN that they use, the acronym in Italy. There are a couple of PRIN projects in Italy that are dealing with post-war, like 49 to 73. There's something going on these days up in Torino, Piemonte, where actually the keynote speaker is Laura Ruberto, and she's going to be talking about something that has to do with the Italian migration and things of that sort. So that's wonderful to see these because PRIN, the project, it's usually a collaborative project of 3 or 4 universities, and there are 3 or 4 universities involved in that. So the doors are much more open now, but we still have a challenge, I think, dealing with some of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that you have all this collaboration and cooperation. And of course, in some cases, we know Italian American studies in Italy are still studied probably not as Italian American studies, but in the American Studies department, which of course can be good and bad at the same time. I understand because of all this distinction. I have a question now, which is more like kind of a sociological question in a sense. What do you think is the average Italian American cultural perception and representation within the United States today? And does this average perception still influence the view abroad, including Italy?
I think so. I think the average perception is still one of, well, I think one of the prominent perceptions, right? I think there are a couple. I think one from from the artistic aesthetic point of view, I think there's still, thematically speaking, the working class Italian, the not so sophisticated whatever. When of course that's not true, because Italian Americans are presidents of major universities. They have been. One only think back to A. Bartlett Chamati, right, at Yale. Italian Americans are in the boardrooms of corporate America. Italian Americans have founded companies that have gone on, Home Depot, Ken Langone, hedge funds, Mario Gabelli funds. Here in New York City, all you see is NYU Langone. With all of his wealth, he gave tons of it to NYU Medical, the whole NYU Medical network. But I think those stories have not yet been told. I think part of the reason is, I think maybe, and I'm just speculating here, but I think maybe some of the artists, some of the filmmakers or novelists or whatever might not yet have figured out how to make the story of the successful Italian American without falling into the trap of hagiography, right? And I think that's part of the issue. And so in that sense, it's easier, I use that in quotes, to do The Godfather and Mean Streets and The Working Class and so on and so forth. I always wonder about that, because let us recognize the fact that American cinema, the first half of the 20th century, has, among the giants in cinema, there's Frank Capra and Vincent Minnelli. And Capra with his, pull yourself up by your bootstraps movies, right? And again, you can go back. I would say that the expert critic, expert student, scholar of cinema could probably go back and see more Italian elements in Capra than perhaps we might think, or at least analogies than we might think. And then, of course, Vincent Minnelli, there's Bugsy Berkeley, but there's Vincent Minnelli, the musicals. And so we need to realize, again, so that's why I go back to not to throw out entirely the generic product made by Italian American. We have to look at it as Italian American to some degree. And those two names are just so important. And there are actors along the way, as you know, that haven't gotten the the credit that they should have. I want to just let our spectators know of a movie that I'm just tickled by. I think it's really good. Some people might see it a little bit formulaic, but I think it's a really good movie, Full of Life, which was made in 1956, which is from a novel by John Fante. And John Fante wrote the screenplay for it. And it's directed by a director at the time, well-known, Quine. But the wonderful thing about it is that we have everything Italian American in it. The working class, the writer, whatever, the parents are working class, etc. The parents live up, this is now in the 50s. The parents live up in Sacramento, California, which is still the country, and they live down in LA. And what's wonderful about this movie is that at the same time that the daughter-in-law is played by Judy Holliday. And if people remember Judy Holliday, they remember Judy Holliday often playing the stereotypical blonde woman who's not so bright, right? Well, here instead, she's very bright. And as she's chatting with her father-in-law, who's this working class, the immigrant Italian, it's wonderful. And it's a wonderful movie. It really sort of in a nice way visits, not revisits, but visits some of the sort of major themes of that we might consider to be Italian American. Yeah.
Thank you, Anthony. All this is very, very useful, I think, especially for me, and very informative. Now I have a question which is more, on the academic aspect of your work, of your profession. Many scholars in the academic world, or even outside the academic world, but many scholars see Italian American studies simply or mostly as part of the larger field of post-colonial studies. The issues that we debate in Italian American studies basically were issues, according to them, that were already debated by when post-colonial studies came out. From your standpoint, as an academic and as a promoter of Italian American culture, is this a natural or an enforced cultural association?
No, I think it's wonderful. I think that to take the notion of post-colonial studies that's dealing, with what Jameson once was critiqued for calling third world. I think it's wonderful. I think the more methodologies not originally adopted for Italian American studies that's brought into Italian American studies is really good. It's look, you mentioned one of my books, The Semiotic of Ethnicity, and that the first chapter may give some people a headache when they read it, right? Because I'm really dealing in a jargon that is semiotic, that falls back to Charles Sanders Peirce, a turn of the 20th century philosopher, the father of American, the father quote unquote of Italian semiotics. If we want to talk about Umberto Eco as the father of Italian semiotics, the grandfather of Italian semiotics, right? Because Eco was, of course, very Peircean in many ways. So, but I did that. There was
Umberto Eco came to Indiana University initially in the 1970s to study the Peirce.
Exactly, exactly, with Sebiak and company, exactly. So I purposely beefed up that first chapter, in which some might say jargon, because I wanted to dialogue also. I wanted to say, okay, look, we can look at Italian American study literature in a certain way. Here it is. But I also wanted people in other ethnic literatures to at least I wanted to catch their eye at least with the title. And that the title then might draw them in, and they might see that, it's not just all spaghetti and meatballs, right? It's not just all spaghetti and meatballs, both from the point of view of the methodology, but also from the point of view of the works involved. And in that, and there, what I did was I took that sort of traditional paradigm that we had at that point and flipped it over to say that the first, the immigrant / first generation writer is not necessarily an abject conciliatory writer, et cetera, but in fact, bingo. And so I tried to do with that. So I just say Ben Venga, whatever you want to give a Derridian reading of Helen Barlini's Umbertina, let's do it. I think that the more ways in which we look at an Italian American product, art product, the the more opportunities there are for us to dialogue with other groups, other, ethnic groups, hyphenated groups, etc. Yeah, because the example I use with the deer hunter, we're going to find so many overriding themes, right? Overlapping themes that it's impossible to ignore. And Fred and I did before, and we're now teaching a master's course, what we call Italian American Modernism, where we're taking some of the early turn of the century writers from Italy and one or two post turn of the century that in some ways are dealing with class issues, whatever. So we have a little bit of Verga, a little bit of Messina, a little bit of Pirandello. And then we have, for structural reasons, Il Codice di Perelaba e Palazzeschi, just because structurally it's so such an anomaly. And then we use Calvino's Marcovaldo, because now we're at mid-century. And then we move on to Pietro di Donato, Tina de Rosa, and so on and so forth, to show that there are these analogs, and not necessarily influences, but analogs. And then we're going to end, of course, with a writer named Mark Ciabattari, who's written only 4 short novels that deal with a character named Rizzoli. And Rizzoli is a type of Italian-American Marcovaldo. And so now, has Ciabattari read Calvino? Who knows? But the idea that here's an Italian writer thinking in these terms with a good dose of sort of satire and that Calvino brings to Marcovaldo, and here is, of course, Ciabattari doing the same thing, right? And so we're trying to make that connection, yeah. And then there's the other connection, and I might be anticipating a question here, and this is something you yourself has worked on, and that is the Italian writer outside of Italy, and in our cases, we've dealt with the Italian writer in the United States, right? And again, I had dealt with a couple of them here and there, and I just thought, okay, so now it's time to maybe try to put something together and create a discourse. And that's where I was delighted you mentioned Un biculturalismo negato, because, and that's a book that deals with 5 different writers, 1 work each, 5 different writers. Of course, De Palchi and Tusiani are 2 names that we all know. De Palchi was at both De Palchi and Tusiani were very important, even beyond the Italian American, right? And beyond De Palchi was a cultural broker here in the United States with Chelsea Magazine, 50 years. Tusiani wrote in 4 different languages. And of course, the wonderful, one of the many wonderful things about Joseph Tusiani is that he was here for 9 years in the United States, and he was the first quote unquote American to win the British Poetry Society's prestigious poetry award. So that's also something that we have to work on more with our friends and colleagues in Italy, the idea that Italian literature, and as the late Nishi said with regard to immigrant literature coming in Italy, that maybe we need to look at literature not with a type of nationalistic label, but with a linguistic label, right? And as he said, I forget now, and it was in a small article that he had published actually, I think in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, he actually says, let's call it allied literature. Let's not call it literature of Italian migration. Let's call it literature in Italian, and full stop, and then we can deal with it. Because when you think about it, think about the likes. Think about, for example, Luigi Ballerini, who has been living in this country for all these years. Pier Maria Pasinetti, for many years at UCLA, writing novels. He published them in Italian. Then he would republish them in English, right? And and I use Ballerini only because recently we highlighted him in Oltre Confine. And here Luigi's been here since 1970, and he publishes in Italy. He publishes Mondadori. Mondadori in 2015 does a sort of collected works of Ballerini, as they did with other friends of ours, right? and yet they don't seem to fit into that paradigm in Italy. Fontanella is another one. I mean, and then of course the couple of the people that I deal with, in addition to Palazzeschi, in addition to De Palchi and Tusiani, Rita Dinale, she wrote two books of poetry, one little sort of memoir, published sort of here and there, but published a couple of books. And she was my colleague early on at Smith College. She was already a senior colleague. And I read her stuff, and I just always wondered, well, how come nobody's writing about her? It's really interesting, interesting stuff. And also in the idea of, then of course the female voice, and there's Rita. So yeah, and we have some 40-something-year-olds here writing in Italian, publishing in Italy. And so who are they? And that was sort of what I was trying to do with Un biculturalismo negato. And in that sense, the notion of Italian diaspora is a much more, I was going to say convenient, a much more inclusive term. Because yeah, it does two things, Andrea. One, it's inclusive, right? So we can say Italian diaspora. One, Helen Barlini. Two, Joseph Tusiani, right? English writing, Italian writing, and so on and so forth. And then all the others that I've met, a couple of whom I've mentioned before. But the other thing is, if we talk about Italian diaspora, and let's say we're just only talking about the Anglos, right, that are writing in English, even there, what we're doing is we're taking it out of the historical, and we're also talking about contemporary. So we're not just talking about Italian immigration to the United States and its legacy, but we're talking about Italian immigration, its legacy, and how that legacy now is being articulated. And so, it's a term, of course. Donna Gabaccia wrote the book, Italy's Many Diasporas, back in 2000. But I recently traced it. We can trace it back in Italian American historical studies being used as early as 92, or 85, I'm sorry, 85. Somebody used the term Italian diaspora in a historical context. And I looked to see when I started using it in 2006. But I remember people saying, you can't use that term because that's a term that historically refers to the Jewish diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, the two tragedies of genocide, right? But I think today, in spite of what our friend Stefano Lucconi has tried to argue, I think today we can use diaspora in this sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anthony. This was wonderful. One last question. I mean, really looking for a brief answer here. We talk about inclusiveness a lot. We're talking about diaspora now, but also inclusiveness. And inclusiveness has been at the core of any cultural and political movement in the last decades, and especially in the last few years, as we know. Italian American Studies have promoted an inclusive view of culture and cultural issues, trying to analyze and mediate, in a sense, past cultural clashes, embracing matters of social justice, often exemplifying with the Italian American experience as one of the parties that endure historical ostracism and prejudice, as you reminded us very properly and very well. Within this unfortunate true historical view, there is also a history of emancipation regarding other aspects related to social justice, such as gender and ethnic equity, for instance, that the Italian American Studies have embraced in full in recent years. How do you see, and very briefly really, because I know this is a very complex topic that will require a meeting, an hour meeting in itself. Yeah. But how do you see the issue of inclusiveness as a fundamental key for the future and for the development of for the future of Italian American Studies?
I think that, and I think Helen started with regard to gender, we need to look back to Helen Barlini. The Dream Book is just, the launching pad for that. And then, of course, along the way, we need to recognize the work of Mary Jo Bona in literary studies, who brought that forward in history. I think Gabachi, Jans McLaughlin have dealt with these issues as well, very well with these issues. So I see it, and there are others out there. You know, there's a whole LGBTQ aspect of this. People forget, in 1989, Rose Romano was working after hours to put together her small but very important journal called La Bella Figura. She did that for a number of years. And then there's another small journal out there called Sinister Wisdom that did an Italian-American issue of lesbian women. So, you know, gay women. So it's good. It all augurs well, and people are still working in these aspects. And I'm happy for that. We'll leave it here and let our colleagues in the academy think about this. Italian-American studies still doesn't have a home in the academy. It is in this interstitial space between Italian studies and American studies. And we often find that Italian studies will tell us it should be in American studies, and American studies will tell us it should be in Italian studies. Sometimes that interstitial space is a privileged space. Sometimes it's not. And so depending on the day and depending on the person, it's a privilege. On other days, it's not a privilege. So that's still, you know, part of what we need to do. Yeah.
That's very true. That's what you're saying is really important. It's very true. Well, thank you very much, Anthony. This was wonderful. And I know that we could be here for hours and hours, but we will have to do it again, perhaps in person.
We will. So, you know,
as the Ragusa Foundation is very close to the Calandra Institute.
We'll plan something. We'll plan something.
We will work together in the future. I'm sure.
Foundation of the Calandra Institute.
We will work together. Yes, of course.
Good.
And thank you again very much for everything you have said and for everything you do for Italian and Italian-American studies, everything you have done and everything you do and will do in the next years. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.